Carla Niederhofer is the program manager at Malta, which is a startup that spun out of Google X, the famous innovation lab focused on generating moonshot businesses at Alphabet. Malta is creating a cost-effective and reliable way to store energy, whether that's wind or solar. So please join me in welcoming Carla Niederhofer.
Are you ready? Okay, well, thank you for that nice introduction. So what I want to talk about today is how we can significantly impact climate change by transforming our electric grid so it can provide affordable, zero-emitting, renewable energy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And some people who may not be as familiar with this might think, well, we already have the answer to that. We can just keep building more solar farms. We can keep adding wind turbines. But it's really not as simple as that. And I'm going to explain to you that there's another piece of the puzzle that's needed to enable this future, and that is long-duration grid-scale electricity storage. So let's talk about 2020. So 2020, as we all know, has been a remarkable year for a lot of reasons, but in particularly in the world of electricity, 2020 saw the vast majority of new generation capacity to come online in the form of renewables, either wind and solar. So that's really good news as we imagine our future with lower carbon emissions. Globally, electricity is the #1 contributor to climate change, accounting for 25% worldwide of all greenhouse gas emissions. And in some regions of the world, the contribution is actually higher than that, as much as 40%. So in the first slide, we're going to look at how the world's electricity is currently produced, and then how that mix is changing as we move into the future. I'm just waiting for my slide. Okay. So in the first slide, we can see, excuse me. So in the first slide, you can look at 2020. And on the left side, you'll see the past 50 years. And you'll see that the vast majority of the world's electricity, starting back in 1970, was generated by fossil fuels to the tune of 75%. And in fact, in 2019, which is when this chart was made, that number had improved, but it was still around 64, 65%. Now, on the right side of the graph, you'll see our future, and those ratios flip. So by 2050, only 25% of our energy is projected to come from fossil fuels. So that's a great improvement, but now we need to figure out how do we get from here to there. And when you look right around 2020, you see an inflection point, and that's an important point. And what you'll notice is that the electricity generated from coal and gas is starting to rapidly decrease, and the percentage of new electricity being generated is coming from renewables. So that's all good news. So can we move to the next slide? And in this slide, we see in this slide, we see what the typical demand for electricity looks like, and then we'll compare that to the availability of when the power is generated from renewables. And what you'll notice is there's a mismatch from the time the electricity is needed to when the wind and solar can actually provide it. So we're just going to break this graph apart for a minute. Now, the red line represents the electricity demand over the course of a week. And you'll notice it's cyclical and very predictable. So what happens here is people are waking up and the electricity demand starts to increase slowly throughout the day. It kind of plateaus a little bit at midday. And you don't really see it on this graph. But then as people come home, you start to, you come home, you turn on your air conditioning, you cook your dinner and turn on your appliances, and then you settle in and watch Netflix. And then when you go to bed, the electricity starts to go down again, the electricity demand. And then we wake up the next day and it starts all over. So based on this pattern of how we consume electricity, how do we build a grid with only renewables? Well, the first block is hydropower, and hydropower is represented as a solid blue rectangle that you see at the bottom of this chart. Hydropower is not available everywhere, but for this example, we're going to assume that it is. Now, the output of hydropower does tend to vary seasonally, so you get a little more power in the spring when the snow is melting and a little less power maybe in the dry season. But in generally from day to day, it gives us a solid, steady supply of clean, renewable energy. So that's a great place to start to build our renewable grid. Now, the next piece is solar. And what you'll see in solar is the patterns are pretty predictable, but you also see it is predictably intermittent. The sun rises and sets every day, and the amount of electricity generated depends on, where the sun is in the sky. So the solar output increases as the sun comes up, it peaks around midday, and then tapers off throughout the afternoon until the sun sets. And what's obvious on this chart is the timing mismatch between when most of the electricity is needed and when most of the solar electricity is generated. So that's something we're going to have to solve. But then suppose we can add wind, and maybe wind can make up that difference. And wind is generally not dependent on the time of day. But on this chart, you see that the wind isn't always blowing the way we want it to. On the right-hand side of the chart, you can see there's a lot of wind, and we're actually producing more electricity than we need. And then on the left side shows when it's generating very little electricity. And so on the left-hand side, the combination of the hydro, the wind, and the solar is not meeting our daily electricity demands. And so we create gaps, and we need to fill these gaps. So, and the way we're proposing you fill these gaps is with storage. So storage, you take the power when that's over generation, that's when you have the excess generation available, and then you store it, and then you release it back to the grid when the energy is needed. And that's how storage solves this problem. I mean, today, honestly, the only solutions we have when we have overgeneration is we actually shut down the renewable assets or curtail the production, which is really unfortunate. And then the way we fill in the gaps is with our fossil fuel assets. And so this is why, electricity storage is really key to making this 24/7 future a reality. So just to take this a step further, I just want to talk about some of the problems that are compounding this issue and some of the dynamics happening in this world that are increasingly putting stress on the current grid. So the first challenge that we already talked about is just the accelerating rate at which new wind and solar are coming online. And in some places, that's driven by governments who take a position that they want to reduce climate changes. And other places, it's driven by economics. And because the fact is that renewables have certainly become the least expensive form of generation right now. And it's why you're seeing, wind and solar farms popping up everywhere. And that is good news, but it does exacerbate the mismatch between the electricity supply and the demand and having to fill, more gaps. And it creates a tremendous problem for our grid operators whose job it is to assure the resiliency of the grid. And just to give an example of this, a few years ago, I toured the backup control center for the New England electricity grid. So it's like a big room with big screens. It's got all of the generators and transmissions lines, and there are operators in the room who are making sure that the electricity is supplied when it's needed. They're matching the demand to the supply, and they've got all these generators, and they're doing it for the lowest cost price. So our person giving the tour was talking about the challenges of renewables, and he gave an example of a recent blizzard. And what happened is the blizzard came on very quickly, and the snowfall was so heavy, it took out all of the solar generation in a large part of New England. So on top of that, the wind was blowing really hard. And when the wind blows too hard, you have to shut down the wind turbines because they can't handle the high-speed wind. So in a very short period of time, they lost a whole bunch of generation from wind and solar that had to be replaced by the thermal fossil fuel assets. So they had to bring these up, keep the electricity going at the same time, dealing with outages from the storm. So that really shows how, just increasing the renewables without the benefits of storage can create huge headaches, for the grid operator. So this is really a great tool for them. The second challenge we're facing right now, as we saw on the chart, is the thermal power plants coal and natural gas are retiring and not be replaced. And we just talked about these are what we're currently using to balance the grid, to make up for the gaps of the renewable energy. So in cases like Germany, they've passed a law that they have to be out of coal by 2038. And other places, just coal can't compete with other forms of generation on an economic basis. And so the utilities are shutting those assets down. And the third challenge that's happening right now with the electric grid is that more and more industrial sectors are starting to electrify. So, for example, the transportation sector, something we're all familiar with. More and more fleets of cars and passenger cars are being electrified. The prices are coming down. They're able to drive farther on a single charge of their batteries. They're able to, you're seeing charging stations popping up. So the infrastructure is there, but as the trend predicts and more electric vehicles come online, it's going to put a huge demand on the grid and the ability to, fulfill the need for all that electricity. So that is certainly a challenge. And when you put all these issues together, the expansion of the intermittent electricity, plus the reduction of the thermal assets that were used to fill the gaps for that electricity, and the growing demand for electricity, it makes the gaps even larger. And it's moving our electric grid into a territory that's basically uncharted and for which it was not designed. Our electric infrastructure was designed, 100 years ago, essentially. So there needs to be a technological solution to these problems if we're ever going to get to a 24/7 green electricity. And that solution, as I may have mentioned, is long duration grid scale affordable energy storage. And that happens to be what my company does. So before we move on, I just want to briefly mention another benefit that storage brings. And that's it gives us the opportunity to build microgrids in parts of the world where there is currently no access to electricity. So, in fact, 840 million people worldwide are currently living without access to electricity. So you can imagine, the opportunities that could be provided to these populations by being able to relatively quickly and economically build a modern microgrid using, wind and solar power coupled with storage, and provide those communities that are isolated from the larger grid to now have their own reliable, 24-hour electricity. And when you think about it, it just truly has the potential to be transformative by unleashing just numerous economic benefits that most of us in the developed world take for granted. So, energy storage isn't new. It's been around for a long time, primarily in the form of pumped hydro storage and also lithium-ion batteries. They've been around a while, and they're both going to be a big part of the solution. But I believe, as many other people do, that additional technologies are going to be needed just to get the scale and the duration that's going to be needed to transform this whole grid. And there are a lot of companies right now, a lot of startups, including mine, working on this grid scale, long duration solutions. And so I'm going to spend the last couple minutes telling you a little bit about my company. So the idea for Malta storage came from a professor at Stanford University, actually. He's Dr. Bob Laughlin. He's also a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. And his idea is that you could take well-established technologies and combine them in a way where you can take the excess electrical energy from the grid, and then you convert that energy into thermal energy in the form of heat by using a heat pump. And then you store that heat in giant tanks of molten salt. And that technology for the molten salt comes for the concentrated solar power industry. And then you store it, and it sits there until you need it, and then you convert the heat energy back to electrical energy and release it to the grid. So Bob pitched this idea to the Google Moonshot factory, and they incubated it there for 2 years. And eventually, when they felt it was ready enough and it could succeed, Malta was spun out as an independent company in 2018. And ever since then, we've been working to develop and commercialize this technology, which is absolutely essential for the proliferation of renewables in order to make the dream of having a decarbonized electricity supply come true. And that's it. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
We do have one question from the audience, from Austin Lee. he wants to know if if you could elaborate, excuse me, on where the storage systems will exist and if there are dangers that might exist in the storage systems as well.
Where they will exist. So we're looking at large utilities, vertically integrated utilities. We've got potential customers there. We've got in California, we just bid into a request for proposal by the California, the community choice aggregates, which aggregate users to put on a little a renewable energy. So we're basically, as a new startup, we're developing the technology, we're doing the design, and we're going into markets where there's a big need for storage. And honestly, in California, they have a huge oversupply of solar energy during the day, and it's getting more and more of a problem.
Right.
In terms of, we're using basically a turbo machinery is the heat pump and the heat engine, and it's a non-combusting turbine. It's a closed-looped Brayton cycle, if you know what that is. And so there really aren't any challenges. There are, of course, there's safety. You've got very high temperature molten salt, but that's well established. And the Malta solution is actually about 100 megawatts with 10 hours of storage. So that is what we're coming to the market with first. And then we can increase the duration of the storage by building more salt tanks. So it's a very flexible, and there aren't any serious safety concerns that aren't that are remarkable to this technology.
Right. Thank you so much.